because I said what was on my mind. I made a lot of enemies. I made a lot
Welcome, everyone, to Science from the Fringe. My name is Bryce Nickels. I'm a professor of genetics at Rutgers University, and I'm thrilled to be joined today by Dr. Meryl Nass. Dr. Nass is an internal medicine physician who practiced for over 4 decades until her medical license was suspended in 2022 for allegedly spreading misinformation about COVID vaccines and for treating COVID-19 patients with hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin. For the past 5 years, she's served as a medical advisor to Robert F. Kennedy Jr. and also helped him edit 3 of his books. She's also well known for her expertise in biowarfare and biological weapons, which includes her research linking the 1978-1980 outbreak in Rhodesia to biological warfare, anthrax outbreak in Rhodesia, I should say. And in her capacity as an expert in chemical and biological warfare, she's consulted on this issue for the Cuban Ministry of Health, the Government Accountability Office, the World Bank, and the U.S. Director of National Intelligence. She's also testified before Congress 6 times on issues ranging from the anthrax vaccine to biological warfare on Gulf War syndrome. In 2023 and 2024, she testified before members of 7 European parliaments and before the Japanese government regarding the WHO pandemic frameworks. And in 2023, very recently, she founded the nonprofit doortofreedom.org, which has a mission of helping the public make sense of a rapidly changing world, resisting efforts by the WHO and UN to centralize authority during emergencies, and preserving traditional farming and the production of healthful foods. Since 2007, she's been a prolific blogger and journalist, writing on bioweapons, pandemics, COVID-19, and global affairs, among other subjects. And you can follow her work on Substack at Meryl's Chaos Letter, which stands for Critical Health Analysis and Opinions, which is currently one of the top-ranked Substack newsletters on science policy. So thank you very much, Dr. Nass, for joining me this evening. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thanks a lot. How are you?
I'm good. Did I miss anything in the...
No.
So what I wanted to talk with you about today is a subject that's very important to both of us, which is control of biological weapons. And in particular, one of the subjects that you've been very interested in your career has been the Biological Weapons Convention. And in fact, a recent Substack post of yours, you actually only a couple days ago, you posted on your Substack an article titled, "Why It Is Super Important to Work on a Strengthened Biological Weapons Convention Right Now." So I wanted to begin, if you could give a bit of a background on how you became interested in the subject of biological weapons.
It's a funny story. So I was a doctor in my 30s and a member of Physicians for Social Responsibility back in 1989. And I was also an occasional instructor at the UMass Med School for medical students, teaching them how to do history and physical exams. And I went to a meeting of Physicians for Social Responsibility, where students from UMass and a member of the organization said that they had discovered in a class that there were professors at UMass who were doing germ warfare research for the Pentagon. And they thought this was a very bad idea, and they wanted our help understanding it. And that one contract in particular was for Curtis Thorne, who was a professor at UMass, to develop better anthrax vaccines. And I spoke up and said, I don't think vaccine development should be equated with germ warfare research. And so some of the men at the meeting said, no, you're just being naive. Of course it is. You vaccinate your own troops and then you use it on the other side. And I, of course, thought they're the naive ones because the United States government doesn't do anything that obvious. But in any event, they asked me to read the CV of the professor, read the grant, and come back and report. And so to show them I was just as smart as they were, I said, okay. And I did that. And I discovered that not only had this professor never done any, and he was 70 or so years old, and he had never done any vaccine research. He'd spent his career on anthrax. And this particular research, while titled that it was for getting a better anthrax vaccine, actually had nothing to do with that, but was research in which many different bacillus species, which have plasmids, which are circular bits of DNA in the cytoplasm that can be transferred between the bacteria. He was, in fact, transferring plasmids back and forth between various bacillus species to learn their properties, which I would say is a primitive form of genetic engineering. And so I reported back and I was concerned. Why was the Pentagon mislabeling its research? And so um, one of the members was a well known Quaker activist, and she was able to get some money and hire a new college graduate, um, John Boniface, who later ran for Attorney General in Massachusetts and became a lawyer. And he started collecting lots of documents for us. And meanwhile, the students at UMass were gathering and challenging the research. And in fact, they started taking over buildings in the spring of 1989. And so UMass then became part of the national news, and the what is it called? The town meeting was asked to make Amherst, Massachusetts, a biological warfare-free zone, which it did. The health department got involved. So there was a big hullabaloo there. And somehow, during this time, I was introduced to the Council for Responsible Genetics, which was an organization that was working to prevent biological warfare and other what I would call misuses of genetics. And it was sort of focused at Harvard. Um, Barbara Rosenberg, Francis Boyle, who was an attorney, Jonathan King, a professor at MIT, Nancy Connell, who was then a Harvard grad student, and a few others were in this group, which I joined. And through them and through the work of Francis Crowe, the activist, and Jonathan Boniface, I became acquainted with this massive amount of literature about the Pentagon's program to deal with the biological warfare threat. I became very knowledgeable about the Biological Weapons Convention, which had gone into force about 15 years earlier. And became close to Barbara Rosenberg, who would go to Geneva and monitor and assist in some ways with the 5 yearly review conferences of the Biological Weapons Convention, because the so if I so I'm blathering, so apologies, but the Biological Weapons Convention had been introduced by President Nixon, probably at the behest of Henry Kissinger, um, in the middle of scandals and a lot of controversy over the Vietnam War. So controversy was that we were in the war in the first place, and also that we may have been using chemical weapons in Vietnam or in Laos and Cambodia. And um, also, two books were published in 1968, one by a congressman who had been a newspaperman from Buffalo, New York, McCarthy, and the other by Seymour Hersh, which both discussed in different ways the U.S.'s very terrible, very disgusting, very worrying biological warfare programs in which we were, developing, growing, weaponizing, stockpiling, tons and tons of biological weapons in the U.S. So, in the midst of all this, the government decided, let's unilaterally here in the United States eschew biological warfare. Let's say we're not doing it anymore. We're going to get rid of our weapons. We're going to stop the offensive research, and we're going to create a treaty, and we're going to encourage the rest of the world to sign on to this treaty in order to end a whole class of weapons of mass destruction worldwide. And so a treaty was developed based on some work the UK had done in 1972. It was signed by most of the countries in the world, and later more were added. So now there are over 183 countries that are parties to this treaty, and it went into force in 1975. But in order to have this treaty be written and signed and ratified so quickly, it required that it not be controversial. And therefore, it left out some critical points. So one of the points it left out was, how do we make sure that everyone is complying with the treaty? And in order to do that, you need certain measures, such as what were called challenge inspections, which means one nation could challenge another and say, I think you may be developing biological weapons at this site, and I want it inspected. And then they would have many countries would go and inspect that site. There were also measures discussed to look at the precursors of biological weapons, things that you need to grow them or make them in some way, and monitor the sales and development and use of these precursor substances. There also needed to be punishments established. What happens if a country is found to transgress the treaty in one way or another? None of these things were part of the treaty, but an agreement was made that they would be developed subsequently, that nations would come together, that every 5 years there would be a review commission to try to develop these measures and add them to the treaty. So that was the plan. And meetings then took place every 5 years. And when the nations thought they were just about on the cusp of finishing, and everybody was ready to sign on with some of these provisions, all of a sudden, the George Bush administration in 2001 said, we've changed our mind. We're leaving the negotiations. We don't want any part of this. And that basically exploded the whole trust and belief that we could have a meaningful treaty developed. Now, I need to mention that in the middle of these negotiations between 75 and 2001, the Chemical Weapons Convention was developed, negotiated, signed, ratified. And so this was really the first time that measures were established and the nations bought into it to do things like challenge inspections and and other measures to make sure that the treaty was verifiable, that compliance was verifiable. So having done it with the Chemical Weapons Convention, we should have been able to do it with the Biological Weapons Convention. But in 2001, it was scuttled. And it's only now, in the past year or two, that scientists and policymakers have started to come together and say, look, maybe the time is right, particularly during the Trump administration, to get this finished, to finally get a verifiable biological weapons treaty done at last. So that's where we are now.
Can I ask you if we can go back to 2001 for a second? So when was that meeting? Or how relative to 9/11 when and the anthrax attacks that occurred in the fall of 2001, did the US withdraw from the Biological Weapons Convention occur before that,
So we
or
didn't withdraw from the convention itself. We withdrew from the meeting. So there was a meeting going on. These meetings used to last 2 or 3 weeks where and there were, you know, as for other treaties, there are meetings of experts that sort of continually to go on by Zoom or some way. But this was the big meeting that lasted 2 or 3 weeks. It was earlier in 2001, where the provisions that were to be added to the treaty were scuttled. So we are still a party to that treaty. Almost every nation is. One of the holdouts that's notable is Israel.
What was the basis for the U.S. not wanting to sign on to those provisions?
I can't remember it's 24 years ago, so I don't remember the details, but it was a shock to everyone. It was as if the United States proved that it was not acting in good faith. I don't think they really had a good explanation. When I looked back on it, I thought, well, the United States had probably used biological weapons in certain situations, for instance, in Cuba. Um, Russia had been developing anthrax weapons also because there was an anthrax outbreak, which was the result of a leak from an anthrax factory in Sverdlovsk in 1979. So Russia was not complying with the treaty. And there had been this, let me see, I think it was 1987, there were the whistleblowers who told a very credible story about how the United States had sent African swine fever to Cuba and caused an outbreak among Cuban pigs, and virtually all the pigs in Cuba had to be slaughtered, 500,000 pigs, in, I believe, 1981. Maybe it was 1977. But around that time, after the Biological Weapons Convention had come into force. So it may have been, at these negotiating tables, uh, funny things happen. So, for instance, the Russians may not have wanted these provisions to become law either, but they didn't say anything. The United States was the first to suddenly say, "We're walking away." And, if you look at the votes at the UN, for instance, you'll find that many nations that may disagree with something don't necessarily vote that way or say so as long as they can hide behind the skirts of another nation. So the question was, looking back, had the United States been hiding behind the skirts of other nations prior to that time? That may have been the case.
You, of course, raised like the most important thing, which is present day. We are, potentially at the precipice of a, strengthening of the Bioweapons Convention. So we had, for those that I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but I'll remind people, on September 23rd of this year, President Trump stood before the UN and said that the U.S. calls on every nation to join the U.S. in ending the development of biological weapons once and for all. What was your reaction to President Trump making that statement and calling for, strengthening the Bioweapons Convention in September? What was your take on that when that was said?
Yeah, and he also issued what do you call it, executive order, which
Right, in May.
yes,
Right.
which limited the gain of function work that the U.S. could do, and stopped the United States funding such research in other countries. And anyway, it went a bit of the way, went part of the way toward developing measures that are necessary to stop biological weapons development.
I guess, sorry, just to be clear, right? So I forgot to mention that before the September statement in the UN in May of 2025, there was this executive order that called, like you said, for, policies to be developed to stop dangerous gain of function research. But I guess, as we can talk about in a little bit, we're still awaiting for that policy to emerge. So
Correct.
I guess, so that gets us to what what are the what do you see as the future here on this issue? I guess both dangerous gain of, but maybe we'll take bioweapons convention first because it's kind of a separate issue, related but distinct from the dangerous gain of function policy. So because the bioweapons convention, that's a global thing that would have to occur versus the the DGOF policy just is applying to the U.S. So how do you see the bioweapons the call for the U.S. for nations to join the U.S. in ending biological weapons research to play out from here?
Okay, so obviously this is a very important thing to do. So we want it done. If it's we want as stringent and tight, a biological weapons convention as possible. What people though need to understand is that the risk of escape of biological warfare agents, which are called potential pandemic pathogens in scientific speak, um, has been increasing tremendously because of all the money that has been spent and continues to be spent on so-called prevention, which is not prevention. And so the pandemic preparedness agenda has um, basically required scientists. I say required, if they want to get money for their grants, a way to do that is to develop more dangerous agents from the ones we already have, and then look for countermeasures to them. And so that has been a sort of quick and dirty way to get funding if you are a biologist, particularly a virologist. And so what has happened is that, yeah, our NIH and the similar government agencies in multiple other countries have been funding science. So we in the US, we fund scientists both in the US and overseas in multiple countries to do gain of function research and create more dangerous pathogens, which they have a lot of excuses for that, saying they're just studying what the genetic what mutations might develop in nature, and we have to be prepared for them. This was the justification for the $100 million that Peter Daszak's organization had received from at least 5 federal agencies. So at least 2 of NIH's institutions, the National Science Foundation, USAID, and HHS. Let me see, some other part of DITRA, Department of War now. So, Defense Threat Reduction Agency are the ones I can think of offhand. You may have gotten money from others.
Well, didn't the State Department, I guess USAID was part of state,
Yeah,
perhaps.
it's sort of USAID was an off outgrowth or offshoot of state, but it sort of managed itself for the most part, and now it doesn't exist. I'm very glad it doesn't exist. It did some good things, and it funded a lot of bad things. It funded many things that the CIA could not fund. Um, it was a dirty agency, and there was probably a lot of money laundering. Do you know what the budget was for USAID?
No. Well, now it's zero, but what was it, the last time it had a full budget?
$44 billion a year.
44 billion, which is, I mean, I think it's close,
Comparable
if
to the
not
State
exact, to the
Department.
NIH
I think
or
it was
the oh,
slightly higher than the State Department, which pays for every embassy in, nearly 200 countries around the world.
right. Well, I was gonna say also the NIH's budget is around that number too,
That's
which is to
correct.
fund
So
all the health research.
that's a lot of money that USAID had to do many things with.
So you're talking about the US government has been funding this dangerous gain of function research, and there's been a call by the Trump administration to stop providing money to that type of research. But um, there, I guess the one question, of course, for you is you have to define what qualifies as dangerous gain of function research and what doesn't in order to, prohibit it from being, done. So in your mind, can you give sort of your, like, how would you sort of define or draw the line on what research, would constitute what shouldn't be funded under the executive order?
So I don't want to do that, Bryce, because Tony Fauci has tried, and others who are in this field have tried to obscure um, what that, that. First of all, they changed. We used to have a term germ warfare, and then it was called biological warfare, and then it was called biological defense. But that wasn't good enough, so then they changed it to gain of function research. And so we know already that people have been trying to mask this type of research using many different names. And this is something that the government, and particularly Department of War, does routinely as they change the name of agencies and they change the name of what they're doing to make it harder for people to research it, to find out what they're doing. So in any event, Fauci has tried to obscure the meaning of the term. So have others. I think we don't want to ban useful research, but there may be useful research that has risks that in which the risks outweigh the benefits. So maybe some useful research needs to be prevented as well. And I am not going to be the arbiter of that. So I'm going to leave it to others to determine what exactly falls into that category. What I will say is that the way many people define gain of function research is research that causes a pathogen, a microorganism, to be more virulent, um, or more difficult to control or easier to spread. And that easier to spread can mean many things. So it may mean fewer organisms to cause infection. It may go to more organs within your body. It may go to more species of animals than normal. Another part of this definition needs to encompass the fact that it may impair the body's immune system in some way so that you cannot fight against the microorganism the way you normally would. So there are many examples of how research has been done into these areas, many different ways you can make a microorganism more virulent or to cause a more serious disease. I guess virulence is a broader term. But in any event, these are the things we don't want. Nobody has any business figuring out how to thwart the immune system in any way. We have a complicated immune system, whether you're thwarting T cells or whether you're thwarting antibodies or whether you're thwarting something else, you have no business doing it. There is nothing good that can come of it. Um, we know that there are 200 reports to the CDC. CDC and USDA jointly run something called the Select Agent Program, where about 60 microorganisms have been defined as having a potential to cause pandemics. And if you're studying any of these roughly 60 microorganisms, and the list changes every year a little bit, you have an accident, you have to report it to the CDC USDA program. And that program gets 200 reports a year in the United States of accidents, of infected mice that escaped, of workers who got infected, of broken vials, of um, failures of the air control system, so that the infected air got out to where it shouldn't have been without being scrubbed. Things like this. So 200 reports a year. Clearly, they're going to be. Many scientists are likely not to report if this happens, if nobody knows about it. People are human. Why would you report something if you're the only one who knows about it? Uh, we don't know how many accidents there are in the rest of the world. And I'm saying accidents. There are also thefts and losses. So there are, hundreds of potential pandemics every year going on as a result of the research that is being done, because the research cannot be done safely. It's impossible. You cannot inject animals with these, say, viruses, and then study them and not occasionally be bitten by the animal. Some people are going to be bitten. If you've got thousands of people doing this, some will be bitten. And that is what happens. Even if you're wearing the best gloves, the best, or your suit. If you may have a suit that controls the inflow of air to you for breathing. So, but sometimes those suits are going to fail. So anyway, because of this, the the biological defense research, so-called defense research, is risky, and it needs to stop, and it needs to stop here and everywhere else. And Trump has done the right initial moves to stop it, and now it is up to people at the NIH who have been tasked at bringing this forward to develop the policies. There are several policies that are required, and to convene the international meetings that will be required to either strengthen the Biological Weapons Convention, which to me, that's the obvious, simplest, best, quickest thing to do. You could make a new treaty, but we've already got a treaty. We're already party to a treaty, and almost every country in the world is a party to it. So let's just strengthen that one rather than starting from scratch.
So just to be clear on your position regarding, research with extremely dangerous pathogens, we were talking about gain of function research, where already very dangerous pathogens are supercharged to become even more dangerous. But then there's the question of how much research should be done with, natural dangerous pathogens. So maybe I misunderstood what you were saying, but I have also expressed concern about how much research is done on dangerous pathogens, but is your position that you want to nearly like eliminate most, if not all, of research on, say, like an Ebola, for example, would be one that's like a naturally occurring virus
Right.
that's extremely dangerous. So
So I
how much?
already answered your question by saying that there's some research for which the risk will exceed the benefit,
Right.
and that should be banned. Now, for Ebola, for instance, there is a vaccine, and it has been used in a lot of people during the last large Ebola outbreak in Central Eastern Africa in 2018 and 19, and yet we don't know how well it works. There's no if people who allegedly got the vaccine had a 60, sorry, not those who got the vaccine. Overall, there was a 60% mortality rate, maybe a little higher in that outbreak. And in usual Ebola outbreaks, the mortality rate is around 50%. It varies. So in that outbreak, even though there was a lot of deployed vaccine, the mortality rate overall was higher than normal, I think higher than any other Ebola outbreak. So do we have a decent vaccine, or do we have a vaccine that may actually make the disease worse, or do we have a vaccine that's ineffective? Is it safe? I don't know those answers. And so that needs to be studied. Um, but when I say it needs to be studied properly. There is no excuse for the fact that probably, 100,000 or more doses were administered, and we don't know the answers to these questions. So the way of studying things by just, using them wantonly during a pandemic, what happens, sorry to say, because these are my compatriots, other doctors and scientists, but an outbreak, particularly of something horrifying like Ebola, is an opportunity for certain companies to try out their products. COVID was an opportunity for many companies to try out drugs that probably had very little chance, if any, of ameliorating COVID. But it allowed them to do clinical trials without having to pay doctors to enroll their patients as subjects. It made it much easier and quicker to perform clinical trials. They didn't have to collect as much data as normal. The informed consents were minimal. And so I think that research that is conducted on any of these very dangerous organisms needs to be much more carefully supervised than it is, and it needs to be of the highest quality. I should mention that Rand Paul has a bill to try to improve, um, I shouldn't say improve, supervise gain of function research. I think his bill is sort of in the is perhaps if Trump and his administration really moves forward with what he has proposed, then Rand Paul's bill is unnecessary. It is not as comprehensive as what Trump has proposed. But if we don't go ahead with the Trump proposals, then Rand Paul's bill, which requires supervision of gain-of-function research funded by the government, would be important.
Right. And I agree with you on a lot of the points you make. I guess one thing I would say about what Trump is trying to do is stated in the executive order. And the reason we would need something like Rand Paul's bill is that if we don't have something like put into law, then a new administration can unwind anything that's sort of, been mandated by executive orders. So
Yes.
I do think, and to your point, the Rand Paul bill doesn't extend, at least in its current form, to stopping this in private entities, I think.
Absolutely.
So
Or
that's a big.
internationally.
Right, and then, of course, there's the international piece. So and that gets to the point about the Bioweapons Convention. How do you if I guess, because currently we're having problems just in the U.S. of, regulating this research. So what does the path look like to having that happen globally?
Well, the thing is, nations are spending a huge amount of money on biodefense. Um, the biodefense lobby is very well funded. The United States, I don't know exactly how much it's spent, but it was estimated by, I think, Francis Boyle once, that we had spent $100 billion since 9/11 on biodefense work. And we are certainly funding BARDA, which pays companies to develop countermeasures to biological warfare agents. And of course, they need the biowarfare agents to get the countermeasures. They are spending billions a year on that. Before COVID, BARDA was spending $1.5 billion a year on countermeasures. But countermeasures are also supported by the the Department of War, by HHS. They were funded, to a great deal within Fauci's agency, NIAID, and they were funded by USAID. The State Department also has a lot to do with global health. So, nations will be able to save a lot of money if they don't have to move ahead with these massive build outs of factories to produce vaccines and drugs as countermeasures. Uh, there's been a tremendous development of such companies and buildings in Geneva, and Italy is proposing to spend lots of money on biodefense. Um, what can I say? The WHO's two treaties that it was trying to bring forward and had to water down, and is still working on the pandemic treaty, would have required, uh, one estimate, 100 to $200 billion globally to build out the infrastructure for monitoring and beginning to respond to pandemics or biological weapons events, and then would cost at least $40 billion a year globally to keep up. So, and those are estimates by I think McKinsey created one of those estimates, was funded by the WHO to provide it. And there are other entities that have created estimates of what it would cost to do what the WHO wanted in terms of its pandemic prevention plan. So I think nations would be financially incentivized to go along unless they have friends in the industry. This is the problem. There are always friends of the leaders in these industries who can be very convincing that, oh, we've got to have this vaccine or this whatever. CEPI is an organization that was founded jointly by Bill Gates and Jeremy Farrar who is now the principal deputy director of the WHO, but was previously head of the Wellcome Trust. So they founded this organization in 2017, I believe, to develop countermeasures as quickly as possible. And one of the requirements to develop them quickly is that there be no liability for the or very little liability for the companies that develop them. And so we're looking at if we go ahead with these projects, um, a situation where the taxpayer pays all the money and takes on all the risk. So you socialize the risk and you privatize the profits to companies that are developing countermeasures. And we could have another situation like COVID vaccine, where everybody winds up being required one way or another. Not maybe not everybody, but many people in the United States, over 100 million, were mandated to receive the COVID vaccines before they had been properly tested. And what CEPI has set up is a situation where that can happen over and over again.
Well, you make a point here, I guess. There's two, I think, key things, which are incentives that you've talked about with relation to like the biodefense sector, and then perhaps something we haven't talked about yet, which is sort of trust. And I guess they're related in the respect here where the question is, if there are so many financial incentives for there, as you've said, there are actually financial incentives for there to be disease outbreaks, and there's incentives for companies, biodefense sector to, you know, continue this dangerous research. How do you think that can be overcome to get a global bioweapons convention that has some teeth? It seems that that would be almost insurmountable, like the financial incentives of you know, the special interests that would, overcome, the will of the people, frankly, as it seems
Right.
to often.
So what we have is a very unique situation where Mr. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. is the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and he has written 2 books about biological warfare and understands the risk and is interested in, putting an end to it. So that's a unique situation. We've never had that before. Whether he is able to accomplish that, that's another question. Whether Trump is serious about it, we don't know. Whether Trump has been incentivized to move away from it, we don't know. Um, a groundswell of public opinion is always helpful. Now, I worked on generating a lot of public opinion regarding the WHO treaties, and particularly the pandemic treaty. And the most egregious provision in that was that the WHO wanted to create a library of potential pandemic pathogens, wanted all the nations to find these things, just like, COVID, SARS-CoV-2, SARS-CoV-1, give them to the WHO, put their sequences online, as well as providing samples to WHO, which already has a library in Spiez, Switzerland, that is holding these specimens and probably studying them in a joint agreement with the Swiss government. So it's got a maximum containment, what a BSL-4 plus lab and Spitz, and it wants to basically collect all these pathogens from around the world and then share them with universities, research centers, and manufacturers. And then it actually said this in one draft of the treaty that they could share these pathogens with anybody they liked. And so this is proliferation of biological weapons. We have to make that very clear. This would be a crime under U.S. law to actually accomplish. That the UN also has I can't remember the Security Council memorandum, but they also are averse to the proliferation of biological weapons agents. And so it might require us. I got a lot of people around the world to understand what I and others, what the WHO was doing, that it was not acceptable. And we eventually got 49 Republican senators, 22 state attorney generals, 26 governors to say they weren't going along with the WHO. So, and that was only a year and a half ago. So, it's not too long ago. People will remember. And I think we can use that to generate interest in such a treaty.
Okay, well, that would be great. I mean, and I completely agree with your point that this is a historic opportunity because of the players involved, and I'm completely certain that Kennedy is fully committed to this issue. He came there with like this is something that's been a long-standing passion of his, and so I, if anybody can do something on this, it's going to be him. And I would also, unfortunately, what that means is that if he can't, that would be very disappointing in a sense, because who else would have such a track record on this issue that could assume such an important position in government, I guess. So to that point, would you disagree if I said this is our best chance at getting something done on this issue?
No, absolutely. I mean, it's a momentous opportunity, and hopefully we can grab it. And certainly, I have been, an advisor to Mr. Kennedy over the years on biological weapons and anthrax and vaccines, and I have certainly encouraged him in this regard. But I agree with you; he is completely committed to this, and so the question is, will he be allowed to push it forward?
What types of things would you like to see happen in the, next month to years that would suggest that we're really making progress towards this goal?
Okay, so the first thing I think would be an announcement that we're interested in developing such a, strengthening the treaty. Either taking the old treaty or starting with a new treaty, but that we are going to, initiate a process to get a treaty. Now, one of the problems is how much the US will be trusted by the rest of the world, because we have put ourselves in a position where we say one thing and do another. We've bombed Iraq, Iraqi nuclear sites. We have assisted Israel in, assassinating negotiators uh, over Gaza. In Was it? I can't remember. Was it in Qatar? I can't remember the country that we were involved with. That we have provided weapons to Ukraine to attack within Russian territory. Um, we and our president has made promises that he hasn't kept. So, will the rest of the world be as willing to go along, or maybe the United States isn't the best country to initiate such a thing? I think we have to prove our bona fides. We have to show that we are serious and we are trustworthy. What Reagan said was trust but verify. And so that's what we need. We need a treaty that is verifiable. And we can't play games. We can't build in loopholes that we can squeeze out of. I think that has often been the goal. This this treaty was not the only treaty that the United States has negotiated and then pulled out of quite late. There have been multiple other UN treaties that we have, pulled out of after having been involved negotiating them. So the issue of bad faith, is a serious one. But I think that the risk of biological warfare is so horrendous, so frightening, that hopefully the nations will go along despite all that.
Have you been following the sort of developments in AI, or I don't know if you recently saw, that there was a 60 Minutes segment where a person that works for that a company called Anthropic was discussing how they were using AI to test out whether or not bad actors could develop bioweapons. I'm not sure if you saw that.
Yeah.
I don't think, I guess my take was I don't think we've learned much. And unfortunately, learned much in the wake of the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic. So I'm concerned, I guess, and I don't know if you have any comments on this, that technology might simply just be out like too fast
Right,
and out of
right.
policy here. So
Yeah, no, I
do you
think that is a real concern. Structurally, if you can figure out the structures of the molecules that are the virulence factors, it may be possible to put them together. And in fact, I happen to be of the belief that that's what was done for COVID. So, yeah, how much can you create on a computer to make a virulent microorganism threat agent? I think it's if we can't do it now, which probably we can, we will be able to do it in the next few years. So, how do you go about stopping that? Well, everybody is under surveillance all the time. Everything you do, basically, online, and even to some extent, we've learned through whistleblowers. Even when you have a computer that is not online, it can be surveilled. So if the NSA wants to, if there are dongles, for instance, that may be used that have a problem, or anyway, air-gapped computers have been surveilled, for what that's worth. So there probably are ways, but are the intelligence agencies going to tell us the ways they have to surveil people's computers to see whether they're developing new bioweapons? I think they can probably do it as long as they know which computers to surveil. That they know, if they know where the scientists are and the mathematicians, maybe they can, maybe they can't. You're right. It's possible that everything's gotten away from us. Everybody in the 50s was, we were told to, this before your time, we had to put our heads under our desks, and as they joked, kiss your ass goodbye. We used to be marched about a mile from our school to a race course where they had a large underground facility. So we would be marched there and stay underground for a little bit as a drill for when the nuclear weapons would be released. So government has managed to keep us frightened of one thing or another pretty much continuously, and yet here we are. So I'm just going to have to be optimistic and assume that despite all of the nuclear weapons that have been lost in the ocean and the near misses and the near releases, nothing's happened, and maybe nothing big will happen in the future.
Final question for you. You have been, and we talked before we started recording, that you've been doing a lot of events recently, some of which are, directly affiliated with the Make America Healthy Again movement. And you talked about how you have, obviously been advising Secretary Kennedy. I was wondering if at these events, has the issue of bioweapons and gain of function been like, is there a lot of interest in those, in that being at those events? Or just, I guess, from those events and talking to people there, what's your sense on enthusiasm to that something can get done on this issue?
The problem with many things today is that they're too complicated, and there's very few people who have enough basic information to conceptualize what the risks are and how to deal with them. So people like you and me are, probably in the dozens around the world. So I can scare people by talking about bioweapons, and I can tell them, I have to make things very simple. When I was trying to explain the WHO pandemic treaty, I had to take screenshots and then explain what these paragraphs or sentences meant in very plain language. And people they didn't have the context to think deeply about it, but they came to trust me because they saw I was showing them screenshots from the actual document. They could read the words, they could understand it, and nobody challenged me as to what they meant. I had consulted lawyers. I had read these documents over and over again until I was sure I understood their meaning. And so what happens is what I'm telling you, and it's disheartening to say the least, is that people will make decisions based on whether they trust you or not, whether they like the way I come across when I give a talk, and or whether they trust the fact that I've advised Mr. Kennedy or that I've done certain research, that I've testified before Congress. I have some credibility based on that, and and so they come to believe what I have to say. But it's the same about medicine, it's the same about law, any subject. It's too complicated. Ordinary people cannot get into the meat of it. So they have to find people they trust and believe what they say. And this is the culture we are living in, and I don't see a way out of it. Even doctors, I think one of the reasons so many 99% of doctors went along with the baloney theories about COVID and the bad treatments and all of that is because they too find medicine so complicated that they were unable or unwilling to dig into the details sufficiently. It took too much time. They don't have that time. They're working hard. They have a family. And so they accepted the words of Tony Fauci and the federal government, and they got wrong advice, and they caused lives to be lost because they carried on with bad treatments, bad ideas, and they didn't deviate, even when their patients were dying in front of them. And so, it's not a problem because people are stupid. It's a problem because they cannot deal with enough information. And that works for the government. It allows governments to put forth their narratives, governments, businesses, other entities, as long as you can corral the media and put forth a narrative over and over again in simple terms using credible individuals, you will be able to successfully convince the country to do whatever you want.
So trust is everything, but sometimes people that we think are trustworthy turn out to not be so trustworthy, sadly,
Correct.
I guess,
Correct.
is unfortunate. So then it becomes hard to distinguish who to trust and who to not trust, and then I don't know. But I guess the point is are you saying that at these events that the issue unfortunately isn't being discussed that much because it's too complicated?
Yes.
At the mo
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, it's not the only, I talk about a lot of things at meetings. Um, so I think people are interested. Certainly I was able to, how I went about fighting the WHO's pandemic treaty was it took me months. I found the right messages. I found the right statements that they had made that incriminated them, and I was able to convey that to the public. And I traveled to 8 or 9 countries, maybe 10, giving talks. I met with a number of members of Congress, and uh, we were able to get basically a mass movement going. We got many, many calls to members of Congress, to governors, and to attorney generals. And uh, it was an egregious effort by the WHO. Once people understood it even a little, because you could read the document. That's what, instead of them having to read a 60-page, legalese document, all they had to do was read a sentence here, a sentence there, a paragraph here, have it explained to them, and that they could understand. When the messaging got clear, we won. So I think we can create simple messages around this. We don't want proliferation of biological weapons. The more research that's done, the more proliferation there will be. We don't want mistakes. One of my slides shows the yearly report from the Select Agent program, which shows how many people were infected, how many people. it's customary for, say, 200 or 300 people to have to go to the doctor every year that have been working in labs that do the gain-of-function research. So, you show people that, and they realize it can't be done safely, and we need to if we're not shutting it down, we at least need to reduce it to a much smaller number of scientists than our current. Yeah, I mean, it's just too lucrative. If you're in these fields, you make, especially if you're on the private industry, you can make a lot more money than, if you work on something else.
And with that, I will thank you, Meryl, for joining me this evening. And I will say, if you want to learn more about what Meryl is up to, you can check out doortofreedom.org and also subscribe to her Chaos Letter Substack. And with that, I'd like to say I'm Bryce Nickels for Science from the Fringe. Thanks, everybody, for listening.